Good day, grade 10s. Just quickly give me an indication if you can hear me.
We can hear you.
Okay, thank you. Great. Okay, we're just going to give it a few minutes so that everyone can join, and then I will officially start in about 2 minutes. Okay, so make sure you have your notes and a highlighter so that you can go through the notes as we're going through it here on the lesson. Okay, so basically I'll just be going through the PowerPoint like your teacher would have done in class, and you can just go through the notes along with the PowerPoint. Okay, but we'll just give it 2 minutes and then we'll start. Okay, so I'm officially going to start. Anyone that joins now must just fall in. Okay, so we're going to pick up where we left off when you guys left. So we're going to start with animal tissue. Some of you might have started with animal tissue already in class. That's fine. We'll just quickly recap it, and hopefully you remember some of the stuff that we discussed already. But we're starting with animal tissue because not all the classes were exactly at the same place. So we're starting where everyone can pick up. Okay, so animal tissue, similar to plant tissue, is a group of cells inside of animals that have a similar function and a similar structure and a similar function. So the definition for tissue is exactly the same. It's just obviously different types of tissue that you find in animals compared to plants. So this picture over here just shows you a couple of the tissues that we are going to discuss. Okay, and then just to give you an idea again of how this all fits together with everything else that we did this year, this diagram nicely lays out what we call the levels of organization in organisms. So we started the year with the atoms and molecules discussing the chemistry of life, and then we looked at the cellular structure, and now we are looking at how these cells combine to form tissue, so similar size.
Just keep quiet now.
Okay, I'm just going to mute everyone quickly. Where do I do this? Okay, I can't see it now. Will everyone just mute themselves? Otherwise, it's distracting for everyone else. So the tissue is when the cells, similar cells combine to form a tissue or tissues that have similar function and similar structure. And then these tissues combine to form organs, organs combine to form organ systems, and different organ systems will combine to form organisms. Okay, so, but for now we are looking at the tissue level, So we're here at the moment. Okay, this is just another way of showing the same thing that we discussed now already. Okay, so this is a brief summary or brief overview of all of the tissues that we are going to discuss. And the reason that I include this is that it does get a bit confusing once you get halfway through the tissues and then you're not sure how they all fit together anymore. So if at any point you get confused, just refer back to the summary over here. Okay, but to start off with, we are going to look at epithelial tissue. Okay, so epithelial tissue is similar to epidermal tissue in plants. Epithelial tissue basically is the outer covering of organisms. Okay, but the difference here is that we actually have outer covering on our inside as well. So I'm not going to go into the long explanation that I usually give for why this is, but basically all of your organs are also lined with epithelial tissue because they are also sometimes exposed to the outside world. So anything that is exposed to the outside needs to be or is usually covered with epithelial tissue. And one of the reasons for this is because epithelial tissue are very tightly packed. So you can see these cells over here, they are very tightly packed together. So things can't easily just get through there. They have to enter through the cells in order to get into the body. So the cells can then control what goes in and what goes out. Okay, so for this reason, epithelial tissue is a very good outer covering for organisms and for organs. So you'll see a lot of the organs that we're going to discuss is covered with epithelial tissue. So as I just discussed, epithelial tissue covers the body and lines the internal organs. The cells are tightly packed and they can be single or multi-layered cells. So this picture over here is an example of multi-layered epithelial tissue, and we call that stratified epithelial. But you don't have to worry about that. It's just sometimes you'll see maybe in a test we refer to stratified epithelial. Okay, it's just so that you know that it's multi-layered, but it's not something that we really test. Okay, but just know that it can be single or multi-layered. And then just the general functions of epithelial tissue, as discussed, is for protection, and then also since it is the outer layer, it has to absorb substances that needs to go into the body. So one of the big main functions is absorption, and then also secretion. So secretion is when your body gives off substances, specifically when it gives off substances that needs to be used elsewhere in the body again. Okay, so secretion is, or let me quickly go on to excretion. Excretion is similar. It's when your body gives off substances that it needs to get rid of. Okay, so in both scenarios, your body gives off substances, but secretion is when it is substances that your body needs elsewhere, and excretion is when your body gives off substances that it doesn't need, that it needs to get rid of. Okay, so just an important distinction there. So when we do mention secretion and excretion, just know that there's a difference between the two. Okay, then the types of epithelial tissue. So it's further subdivided into 4 different types. So we have squamous epithelium, cuboidal epithelium, columnar epithelium, and ciliated epithelium. Okay, but we're going to look at all 4 of those in depth. And then just mention here again, the number of layers will determine, also you have single and multi-layered epithelial tissues. And when it is one layer, it is called simple epithelium. And when it has multiple layers, it is called stratified epithelium. Okay, but like I said, just know that you can have multiple layers, but don't worry too much. We're not going to try and confuse you with simple and stratified. It is just a fact that you must know. Okay, and here's just to show you all of the tissues, but I'm going to go ahead and do all of them individually. I'm not going to spend time on the slide. Okay, then the first epithelial tissue. So this is where the content actually starts. Okay, is the squamous epithelium. So the squamous epithelium are these quite thin, almost like brick-shaped cells like the epidermal tissue in plants. They have quite large nuclei, So they have a bit of a bulge like this, so it stands out a bit. So if you look at it from the side, then it is this bottom diagram, and if you look at it from the top, then it is this mosaic of different shaped cells forming this flat surface almost. Okay, that is squamous epithelium. So where do you find squamous epithelium? You'll find it in the lungs and in the blood vessels. There's also other places in the body that you would find it, but these are the two that we focus on because these are two structures that we do discuss in grade 10. So we focus on those two areas where we find squamous epithelium. Okay, so in the alveoli of the lungs, so that is basically the air sacs inside of the lungs, that is lined with squamous epithelium and also the blood vessels. And the reason why we find it specifically in this location is because it's linked to the structure. So let's quickly look at the structure. So as discussed, the squamous epithelium is flat, okay, so meaning they're quite low, have a low profile, unlike the others which are quite tall, and they have an oval nuclei, okay, and their function is to protect the underlying tissue, and then also very important, they are thin so that substances can easily diffuse into the cells, okay, so this allows for very efficient exchange of substances, specifically for gases to easily move in and out of the cells. Okay, and we call that gases exchange. So this is why we see squamous epithelium in the alveoli and in blood vessels, because this is where gases and other substances needs to move in and out of the cells a lot. Okay, so every time you breathe in, your lungs need to quickly absorb the oxygen that you just breathed in. So it needs to happen as quickly as possible. So for that reason, squamous epithelium is very effective. So that's why we find squamous epithelium in the alveoli. Similarly, in the blood vessels, while the blood is passing through your blood vessels very quickly, you want it to quickly absorb the nutrients that is needed. So for that reason, we have the squamous epithelium, which is thin, so substances can easily and quickly be absorbed. Okay, so that second point there, function, it is thin for easy diffusion. And then lastly, it is smooth, okay, and that reduces the friction so that you don't have a lot of rubbing together, and it doesn't, there's not a lot of wear and tear, and things can easily move through the blood vessels and other parts of the body very quickly. So wherever you need a bit less friction, you're likely to find squamous epithelium. Okay, but the kind of the main one here is the top two, okay, protection and thin for easy diffusion, okay, because that links to the location that we focus on, the alveoli and the blood vessels. Okay, then the diagram. So you have this diagram in your notes, but you also must know how to draw it, because as I think I mentioned it in your assignment or your homework, that it is very important that you know how to draw all of these drawings that we do. Normally you have to do it in class so that we know that you at least practice drawing it once, but in order to speed up the process, we printed it for you, but with the idea that you go practice drawing it at home. And the reason is because you're going to get some of these drawings in your test, and if you try and study these drawings the night before, just by looking at them, I can promise you it's not going to be effective. You're going to miss labels. You're going to incorrectly draw things. So the more you practice it, the better you get at it. Okay, and also you get better at the actual act of making biological drawings and not falling victim to the mistakes that people usually make. Okay, so that's why your first homework assignment is to do all the drawings. Okay, so in your own time at home, please, at the back of your book, draw all of the drawings. Okay, so this first one, squamous epithelium, very simple. You can see here the oval nucleus, and then all of the cells are on what we refer to as the basement membrane. Okay, so it's just the membrane at the bottom of all of the cells where all of them are connected to that membrane, basically. And then epithelial tissue always have to be bound to some other tissue, or always are going to be bound to some other tissue. And the best way of connecting these different tissues is through a connective tissue. And specifically in the case of epithelium, we have areolar connective tissue. Now we're going to discuss areolar connective tissue later, so don't worry too much. But this is the tissue that connects the epithelium to the underlying tissue. Okay, so you'll see this come up. So these labels are basically repeated for all of the epithelium tissues because they all have similar structures. Okay, so let's move on. Then cuboidal epithelium, as the name might suggest, this is cube-shaped epithelium cells. So where do we find this? We find this in glands. So glands are areas of the body where things are secreted. So for example, the salivary and sweat glands. Okay, and we also find this in the kidney. We also find cuboidal epithelium in the kidneys. Okay, also elsewhere, but these are the two that we focus on. Okay, so structure, they are cube-shaped cells with a round nucleus. Okay, so in this case, the nucleus is round and not oval. And the functions of the cuboidal epithelium is to secrete substances. Okay, remember the difference between secretion and excretion. Secretion is when your body makes substances that it will use. Okay, so for example, saliva or sweat. Okay, those are, sweat also has a bit of excretion in it, but saliva specifically, okay, your salivary glands produce the saliva, and the saliva is then used again to be mixed with food to break down the food and to make it go down easily through your esophagus. So saliva is secreted and then used later by the body. Okay, so that's the difference between secretion and excretion. Okay, so one of the functions, okay, is secretion. And then the second function in the kidneys specifically is these cuboidal cells will reabsorb substances. Okay, so this is a process that we look at in grade 11, okay, where how the whole urinary system works. So I'm not going to try and explain that now, but just important to note is that at the kidneys, certain substances needs to be absorbed or reabsorbed, and that the area where that happens is lined with cuboidal epithelium. Okay, then again, the diagram. So in this case, it's exactly the same labels. It's just the shape of the cell that looks slightly different. Okay, so again, practice making the drawings. Then the third epithelium tissue is columnar epithelium. So where do we find this? The main place where we find columnar epithelium is in the digestive system. Okay, now again, this is a system that we do in depth in grade 11. And in fact, we actually do a bit of a recap of columnar epithelium because they play such a vital role in the digestive system. Okay, so important there, like location, digestive system. The cell shape, they are elongated or rectangular, so long cells with a round nucleus, usually close to the bottom of the cell. Okay, but that's not too important. Just know that they are elongated and have a round nucleus. And then we also find specialized columnar epithelium called goblet cells. Okay, and we're going to look at this now when we look at the diagram. But basically, these goblet cells secrete mucus. Okay, so again, we discussed this more in depth in grade 11, but mucus is required in the digestive system well, not just the digestive system, but where it is secreted, it will sometimes trap foreign bodies in this mucus and makes it easier then to get rid of the foreign bodies. Mucus is also used for lubrication. So mucus is very important in a variety of areas in the body. And you need cells that are good at secreting a lot of this mucus, and these cells are called goblet cells. Okay, and you'll see now why they are called goblet cells. But then quickly just moving on. So two of the main functions of columnar epithelium is absorption. So because this is in the digestive system, okay, we have to absorb the nutrients from the digestive system. So that absorption is aided by the columnar epithelium. So one of the main functions, absorption of digested food or of nutrients. Okay. And then also, as mentioned, the goblet cells secrete mucus. Okay, so that's another function of columnar epithelium, is to secrete mucus. Okay, and here is some of the functions of the mucus: is to trap foreign particles, lubricate fat, and provide moisture. Okay, so let's quickly look at how these goblet cells look like with the other columnar epithelium, and then I'll discuss it a bit more in detail. Okay, so here you see a goblet cell here in the middle. So everything else stays the same, except here's now one of those specialized cells called goblet cells. And the reason it is called a goblet cell is because it forms a bit of a goblet. So a goblet is basically like a glass. So if you can use your imagination a bit, you can see that that looks a bit like a glass or a goblet. Okay, and that's why it's called a goblet cell. And in this space here in the middle is where the mucus forms. And the mucus stays there and is released when it is needed elsewhere in the organ where this is found. Okay, so important there, the mucus is produced here in the goblet cell, and then it's released for those variety of functions that we have discussed. Okay, so again, make sure that you know this diagram and practice drawing it. Okay, then the last epithelium tissue is ciliated epithelium. So ciliated epithelium is very similar to, or at least the one that we look at. I'll speak a bit louder, the grade 12s are in the passageway. So the one that we look at, the one ciliated epithelium that we look at in grade 10 is specifically columnar ciliated epithelium. But you do also find, or you can also find other epithelium that is ciliated, but we focus on the columnar one because they are by far the most prominent. Okay, so where do you find this ciliated epithelium? We find them in the air passages. Okay, so in your breathing tubes, basically. Okay, so everything from your trachea down into your lungs. You also find them in the oviduct. Okay, so that is the fallopian tubes in the female reproductive system. And you also find them in the urinary tubes. Okay, so we'll discuss all three of those very briefly when we discuss the function. Okay, then how does this ciliated epithelium look like? Okay, so as mentioned, the ones that we look like are elongated cells, so basically like columnar epithelium, but the difference is they have these tiny little projections, hair-like projections on them called cilia. Okay, so cilia are hair-like projections on the surface of cells. And we're going to discuss a bit later what the function of the cilia is. Okay, and then as I mentioned, any epithelium can have cilia, but most are columnar. Okay, then so what is the cilia and what does it do? Why is it needed? So the cilia makes flickering movements. Okay, so basically it just moves back and forth. I'll show you on the next slide an animation of how that looks like. And one of their main functions is to remove foreign bodies that is trapped in the mucus. Okay, so these ciliated epithelium will also have goblet cells that produces mucus, which will then trap the foreign bodies. And then one of the functions of the cilia is to flicker back and forth, and it will then expel the mucus. So if you have been sick during this time, then or you had a bit of a cough or an itchy throat, and you have a bit of phlegm, then you would have seen this in action of how this works. So when you are sick, specifically with a respiratory illness, then a lot of the times there'd be foreign bodies that your body tries to get rid of. So it will then produce a lot of this mucus. This mucus will then trap the foreign bodies, and then your body has to get rid of it. Okay, so then you will cough it up. Now, yes, there's a couple of ways that your body helps you to cough it up, okay, by coughing and expelling air very quickly. But one of the other ways that your body does this is by the cilia, okay, basically moving it out into your throat, where it will then start irritating you, and then you will cough as a result. Okay, so in order to help get the mucus basically in the escape hatch, these cilia move the mucus up your respiratory tract. So you can imagine that it is quite effective at doing it because it has to work against gravity. Okay, gravity wants it to go down deeper into the lungs, but the cilia moves the foreign bodies out into the trachea where it can then be coughed out. Okay, so that's just a an example of where we would see the cilia in action. And another example is in transporting egg cells in the fallopian tube to the uterus. Okay, so when the during fertilization or before fertilization, when the egg has to go to the uterus and could potentially be fertilized, it needs, so every month in the female reproductive system, the egg has to move to the uterus. And the way that the egg makes its way to the uterus is by the cilia also moving the egg along the fallopian tube. So that's another example of where we see ciliated epithelium with the cilia having the special function of moving things around. Okay, so let's quickly look at how this looks like, how this movement looks like. Okay, so this is a simple animation. So it's not quite as rigid as it looks here in this animation, but this gives you a pretty good idea of how the cilia works. Okay, so it pushes forward and then it drags back. Okay, and this ensures that the movement stays in one direction and it doesn't move things back and forth the whole time. Okay, so, but this is a very simplified animation, but I think it does give you a bit of an idea of how this works. Okay, and then again, here's the diagram, and it's exactly the same as the columnar epithelium. It just has these hairs on them. Okay, so, and the label there is cilia. Okay, so again, practice the drawing. Okay, then we can move on to connective tissue. And I'm going to see if I can finish connective tissue. Well, no, if I can get to bone by the end of this lesson. Let's see. Okay, so that we've now discussed epithelium tissue. So now we move on to the second main type of tissue called connective tissue. So as the name suggests, connective tissue binds and supports other tissue. Okay, so it binds different tissues together. So all organs will have some sort of connective tissue to bind all of these different tissues together. Basically like the glue of the body, even though like you might not think of it that way when you look at some of the examples. Okay, so what is examples of connective tissue? Well, blood, bone, cartilage, tendons, ligaments, okay, that areolar connective tissue that we mentioned earlier. Okay, those are all of the examples of connective tissue that we are going to look at. Now, one important thing, if I go back there up to the top, one important thing to look out for when we do all of the different connective tissues is to look for these three things, okay? Because all connective tissue, or for the most part, there's a few exceptions, but most connective tissue will have these three elements, okay? They will have some cells, and then they will have certain fibers, and then they will have a non-living matrix, okay? So you'll see this especially when we do bone and cartilage and the dense connective tissue, then you see all three of these things. So just look out for them. You don't, I'm not going to try and trick you with this, asking you what are the cells and the fibers and the matrix and this different tissue, but it's just something to look out for where most connective tissue consists of these three elements. Okay, so let's look at one example of that. So the first connective tissue that we look at is blood. So this might not seem strange because you don't really think of blood as a connective tissue in the same way that you would cartilage or bone. But it is, because one of the reasons it is because it has those three elements that we just discussed. Not so much the fibers, but the other two things. So blood consists of different kind of structures. Two of them are cells, yeah, erythrocytes and leukocytes. The third one is thrombocytes, is like cell fragments. They're not quite cells, but like cell-like structures. And then plasma, which is the matrix of the blood. Okay, so we're going to look at all four of these parts of the blood now in more depth. Okay, so the first two are the cells. Okay, the red blood cells and the white blood cells. Here's just a diagram that you have to know. So usually what I do when we do blood is I make you draw the circle, and then as we go through the different parts, I make you draw in the parts of the... Sorry, can you guys still hear me? Because my Zoom just did something weird. Okay, no, I think so. So the sorry, where was I? Oh, so then I make you draw in the different parts of the blood. So you would first draw the red blood cells, then the white blood cells, platelets, and the plasma. So you can do that as well, but just make sure that you know the different parts and what their functions are as well. Okay, so let's look at the first part. Erythrocytes, red blood corpuscles. Okay, so this is a common misconception, and we do, like even as us as teachers, oftentimes say red blood cells, but in fact, red blood cells are not cells. So it's incorrect to call them cells. And the reason they're not cells is because they don't have nuclei and organelles. They're basically just a membrane with certain very important things in them, but they're not quite cells. So they're actually called corpuscles, and the definition of a corpuscle is a minute, free-floating cell that lacks a nucleus and organelles. Okay, so it's a bit confusing, but just know that it's a cell without a nucleus. Just think of it like that. Okay, so for that reason, we can't call it a cell. We have to call it a red blood corpuscle. But the name that you actually have to know is this complicated Latin name, okay, called erythrocytes. Okay, so that is the name that we're going to expect in tests and exams. So erythrocytes are biconcave, meaning they have two indented sides. Okay, so if you look at it from the side, then you would see, okay, it has two indented sides in the cell. So it's basically, if you take a ball and you squeeze it at both ends, then that would basically be the shape of the red blood cell. Okay, then also as mentioned, it doesn't have a nucleus. And since it doesn't have a nucleus and organelles, it is quite flexible, meaning it can squeeze through quite tight spaces. Okay, so your blood system has to go to all parts of the body, and those blood vessels get very small. So in order to get through those blood vessels, your red blood cells need to be able to squeeze through there. Okay, and since they are flexible, they can change their shape a bit and easily squeeze through these small capillaries. Okay, then another important thing about red blood cells is they contain this vital protein called hemoglobin. Okay, so another complicated Latin name there, hemoglobin. Hemo refers to blood. The function of hemoglobin is to transport oxygen and carbon dioxide. So those of you that were in my class last year, I had this long analogy about how oxygen and carbon dioxide gets transported throughout the body by visualizing how taxis transport people. So if you think of taxis as being a transport system for people, then hemoglobin is like the taxi for oxygen and carbon dioxide. Okay, but we'll elaborate a bit on this in one of the other slides. Okay, and then so the main function of erythrocytes. Okay, so if you remember anything from this, okay, remember the main function is to transport oxygen and carbon dioxide. Okay, that is what erythrocytes do. They take oxygen from the lungs to the body cells, and then they take carbon dioxide again from the body cells back to the lungs. Okay, that is their main function. Okay, and they continuously do that all the time. Okay, that's why I say it's like a taxi. So they pick up the oxygen at the lungs, take it to the cells, and then drop them off, and pick up the carbon dioxide and take it back to the lungs and drop them off. Okay, so let's quickly look at hemoglobin. So as mentioned, hemoglobin, so this is not in your notes because I decided since we are reducing things a bit this year, this is technically not in your textbooks either. This is just a bit more information, so I didn't include it in your notes. So I won't ask anything about this in your tests or exams. Okay, well, let's just quickly discuss it. So hemoglobin is a protein that contains iron, so that's why you need iron in your diet, so that you can make hemoglobin. So if you don't have iron in your diet, you oftentimes feel lightheaded because you don't have hemoglobin, and that results in you not being able to transport oxygen to your brain, which makes you lightheaded. Okay, so iron is an important mineral in your diet. And these hemoglobin molecules have 4 binding sites, so basically like 4 seats on the taxi for oxygen and carbon dioxide. Okay, don't worry about the long names here. Then carbon dioxide and oxygen form temporary bonds with hemoglobin. Okay, I'm going to skip this. It's not that important. Yeah, at the end, long exposure to high altitudes allows your body to produce more erythrocytes due to the low air pressure and the low oxygen levels. Okay, so basically, again, not going to ask this, but basically, if you are at higher altitudes, there's less oxygen in the air, and then your body actually makes more red blood cells and more hemoglobin to compensate for the lower oxygen. Okay, but again, if you don't understand that, don't worry for now. This won't be in the work that we do this year. Okay, then back to the stuff that is important. Okay, so this is in your notes again, so make sure that you focus again. Okay, so the second type of cell in blood is called leukocytes. Okay, and these are your white blood cells. Now you get different types of white blood cells. So here at the bottom, you can see a bunch of different ones with some complicated names. And they each work a bit differently and they each have a slightly different function. But all in all, the overall function of all of the white blood cells is to give immunity to the body. Okay, so they fight off diseases basically. Okay, that is what your immune system does. So they protect you from pathogens, foreign particles, and diseases trying to get into the body. Okay, so that is what your body is currently doing to fight off the flu and the bacteria and the viruses in the air. And if you do get infected, then it's also your immune system that cleans up and drives the pathogens out of the body again. Okay, so a few ways that it does this is one, by engulfing foreign bodies or pathogens. So basically, the cell will wrap around a foreign body, and then it will ingest that foreign body into the cell, and it will then trap it inside of this cell, and it will then expel that cell out of the body. Okay, so basically, the cell sacrifices itself, and it engulfs. So it's a nice word. It like surrounds the cell and take the pathogen into the cell cytoplasm of the cell, and it digests it there and then gets rid of it. Another way by which these cells give you immunity is by forming antibodies. Okay, so this is how your body would fight against COVID if you were to get it. It would make these antibodies, which will then signal the immune reaction that needs to take place to get rid of the virus. So, antibodies is one of the main ways that we fight off pathogens in our bodies. So just know that the function of leukocytes is to give immunity, and the two ways that it can do this is by engulfing foreign bodies and forming antibodies. Okay, that's literally, you don't have to explain anything that I just explained. You just have to know those two facts. Okay, and then as mentioned, there's different kinds of white blood cells, and they all work a bit differently. Okay, then the third type of, or the third structure inside of blood is called thrombocytes. Okay, or sometimes just referred to as platelets. So these are, as I mentioned, cell fragments. Okay, so they're not quite cells, but they have some elements of cells, but they're not cells. What they do is very important, is they clot the blood. So if you get a cut or a wound of some kind, then if that blood isn't stopped by something, then the blood will just continue flowing out of the wound, and you will eventually bleed to death. So in order to stop this, animals have evolved in a way that there's something inside of blood that reacts with the air and will start clotting if it is exposed to air. So for this reason, or the thing that enables this is the thrombocytes, the platelets. So the platelets clot the blood, and they then form a scab and then stop sorry, I was a bit distracted there. Stop the blood from flowing out of the wound. Okay, then lastly, the plasma. Okay, so the plasma is the matrix that we spoke about earlier. Okay, so I'll just quickly pause here and explain what the matrix of in connective tissue does. So the matrix is basically the cement of the connective tissue. Okay, so that's the substance that everything else is in, and it keeps everything else together. So the matrix in connective tissue is very important. In the case of blood, the matrix is the plasma. So the plasma in your blood is basically just a watery fluid where all of the other cells can exist in. So without the plasma, the cells or your blood would be quite thick and it won't be able to flow. So the plasma makes it watery, makes it able to flow, and it transports all of these things that we've discussed, and also other things like the nutrients that needs to be transported throughout the body. It transports that and it provides a medium where all of these things can take place in. Okay, so it is the extracellular matrix of blood, and it consists mainly of water, and water then acts as a solvent for a bunch of nutrients and salts and vitamins, hormones, plasma proteins, oxygen, and metabolic waste. So all of these things are also transported by blood. And then, as discussed, the function of the plasma is to transport cells and substances where they are required or potentially excreted elsewhere in the body. Okay, so I think that's all for blood. Here's the diagram that you have to draw. So this is just a bit simplified from the one that you have in your notes. So I just reduced the number of things inside of the sample. So I just have a red blood cell here from the kind of front, and then a red blood cell from the side, and then one white blood cell and a few platelets, and then the yellow is the plasma. So it just reduces it, so it makes it a bit simpler to see everything that is in there. Okay, okay, we're on 42 minutes. I think I'm quickly going to do bone tissue, and so that then leaves us enough time to do the rest in the next lesson. I just quickly want to see something. Okay. Okay, if anyone has any questions, you can interrupt me now before I start with bone tissue. But otherwise, then I'll just continue, and I'll try and wrap this up in 5 minutes. Okay, let's quickly look at bone tissue. Okay, so bone tissue is another type of connective tissue. So again, we're going to see those three things. We're going to see a matrix. We're going to see some fibers, even though we don't really discuss the fibers, but they are fibers. And we're going to see some cells. Okay, so right off the bat, we mentioned here that the bone tissue consists of a hard matrix, which is made up of minerals, specifically calcium and phosphorus, but also a bunch of other minerals, and then also collagen fibers. So here we mentioned the fibers, but we don't really focus on them too much. So the matrix is basically all of the white stuff that you see is the matrix. So that's most of the bone. But the important parts of the bone, the parts that make the bone a living organ, is the other parts that we are going to discuss. So maybe it's a good idea just to quickly move over to this diagram over here. So this is actually quite confusing, and I spend a bit more time in class on this usually. When we look at bone, you think of bones as large bones that you can clearly see everything that's going on. But when we discuss bone tissue, then we are looking at the microscopic level of the bone. Okay, so what you see here, what you see here, these circles are when you look at bone through a microscope. Okay, so everything we're going to discuss now is the microscopic structure of bone. So don't think of large bones and the big parts of the bones. This is when we zoom in on the tissue level of the bone. Okay, so we have the matrix, which is made up of the minerals. Then these next few are quite confusing because it's quite big words that is complicated to say, but I'll try and make it as simple as possible. So here in the center of these circles, you see a little black dot, or a large black dot compared to the others. That is called the Haversian canal. And that is where your nerves and your lymph vessels and your blood vessels are going to run. Okay, so that is what is going to connect the different part, or that's what's going to allow your bones to be living. Okay, because your bones can't be living if it doesn't have blood supply and it doesn't have nerves. Okay, otherwise it would just be minerals. Okay, so what allows the bones to be living is the Haversian canal, which is a small little hole where blood vessels and nerves can run through the bone. Okay, but it can't just go through that middle part there. It also needs to take substances to other parts of the bone, and that's where the other structures, the other black dots and lines come in. Okay, so what are these black dots and lines called? The lamellae are the circles, so you can't really see it there, but in our diagram we make it a bit more easy to see. But it's basically the circles that go around the black dot in the middle. Okay, so a fancy way of saying it, it is the concentric layers around the Haversian canals. Okay, so basically just the circles that go out from it. Okay, then in these circles you will find lacunae. Now lacunae are basically just tiny little holes, tiny little divots in the bone where we find bone cells. These bone cells are called osteocytes. Okay, so these osteocytes, the bone cells, are found in the lacunae, which is located in the lamellae. Okay, when we go to the diagram, you'll see this a bit better than in this picture over here. Okay, so we have the lamellae, then the lacunae, and then in between the lamellae and so basically in between all of this, you have tiny little canals that connect everything together. And those are called the canaliculi. Now that's probably the most difficult word of the bunch. And one way that I happened to see once on another video was a way of remembering it is, can I lick your eye? So if that helps you, then you're welcome to use it as a way of remembering it. Okay, can I lick your eye? Okay, so please don't write anything about licking anyone's eyes in a test or exam, but hopefully it does help you to remember how to pronounce it and spell it. Okay, so the canaliculi are small canals that connect the lamellae and the lacunae to each other. Okay, again, I will show these again when we look at the diagram. Makes it a bit easier to understand it. And then another part that we find, another part of the tissue that we find in bones is called the periosteum. Now this is actually not here with the microscopic structure. This is actually a membrane that surrounds the whole bone. Okay, so around the bone you will find a membrane that we call the periosteum. Okay, so a fibrous membrane that encloses the bone. Okay, so it is, the reason that we highlight it here is because it is different from everything else. So this is like a fibrous material, whereas the bone is more like almost like a rock because it is made of minerals. So the periosteum is different from everything else, or everything else of the bone. Okay, so this is, we're just quickly mentioning the functions here, but we focus more on the functions when we do the skeleton later on. Okay, so I'm just quickly going to go through it. So some of the functions of bone is to provide a framework, supporting framework for your body, so your skeleton. It forms levers for locomotion, so your bones are usually quite long and your muscles can pull on them, and that allows you to move. It stores minerals, so we just said that the matrix contains a lot of minerals, so that also acts as a storage place for minerals. Inside of bones, there's areas that produces red blood and white blood cells. Okay, but again, we do this a bit more when we do the skeleton. Okay, and then lastly, it can sometimes protect your organs. For example, your ribs that protects your lungs and your heart, and your skull that protects your brain. Okay, so it also provides some protective function. Okay, here's just that diagram enhanced. This can help to understand it a bit better, but I'm going to move on to our diagram that we have in our notes. Okay, so this diagram over here, let's quickly go over everything again. So here in the center, thank you for drawing on my notes. I don't know who it was. So here in the center, we have the Versian canal. Can I also draw? Maybe that can help. So here in the center, we have the Versian canal. Okay, so that's where you're going to find the blood vessels and the nerves. And then here, going around it, you have the lamellae. Okay, so those are the concentric rings. Thank you, Xander. And then over here, you have the lacunae. Okay, so those are the areas where we are going to find the osteocytes. So yeah, lacunae that houses the osteocytes. Okay, so this is basically like a house for the cell. Okay, so the bone cells are found here in the lacunae. And then to connect all of these together, we have these little things that looks like spider legs. Okay, and those are called the canaliculi. Can I lick your eye? Okay, so I know this is definitely one of the more complex things because everything is new and all of the words are complicated. So make sure that you spend some time and you get used to this terminology. And the more times you go over it, the more you'll get more used to it, and it will be easier to remember. Okay, so go over it a few times and ask if you have any questions about this. Okay, and I think, okay, now how do I stop drawing? Xander, how do I stop drawing? Okay, there we go. Okay, so here's a video that you can watch if you want to, but I'm obviously not going to show it to you now. Okay, you can watch that at your own time. Okay, so that's it for today's lesson. I think that was about 40 minutes, a bit more than 40 minutes. So I hope it was helpful. If you have any questions, you can quickly ask me now. Otherwise, I see you guys next week, and enjoy the long weekend, even though you're technically on a very long weekend. So yeah, if you do have any questions, ask now. Otherwise, see you next week. Oh, and remember to do the activities. I'm going to post some questions about the animal tissue and also draw all of the diagrams. Okay, if there's no questions, thank you for decorating my slides. See you next week.